If full preterism is correct, then the end of the age happened exactly when Jesus said it would, within that generation, in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So the question is not whether prophecy failed, it didn't. The question is how the church failed to recognise its fulfilment. To answer that, we need to be clear from the outset about what full preterism actually is. It's not speculation about the future. It is covenant eschatology. It is the story of Israel's covenant reaching its appointed end and the kingdom arriving in concrete historical reality. The end of the world in Scripture is not the end of the planet. It is the end of that world, the Mosaic Age, the temple system, the covenant administration that defined Israel's relationship with God. Once that's understood, everything comes into focus. The phrase, "What is Plato but Moses speaking Attic Greek," originates with the Middle Platonist Numenius and is preserved by Eusebius in Preparatio Evangelica. Eusebius adopts and transmits the claim within Christian theology. Eusebius introduces Numenius as a credible pagan witness, someone whose testimony serves his apologetic case. The point Eusebius wants to establish is clear. Hebrew revelation is older than Greek philosophy, and Greek philosophy derived its best insights from the Hebrews. Christianity, therefore, is not intellectually inferior to Hellenism. Eusebius believes Plato borrowed from Moses. He believes Greek philosophy contains fragments of truth. He also insists Hebrew revelation is prior and superior. What becomes decisive, however, is the assumption that follows. The assumption that Greek philosophy and Hebrew revelation are essentially saying the same thing, just in different idioms. That assumption is where things begin to go wrong, because Plato is not Moses in Greek. Plato is doing something fundamentally different. Hebrew thought is covenantal, historical, relational, embodied. Greek philosophy is abstract, metaphysical, intellectual, and increasingly detached from lived history. When the early church accepted Greek categories as neutral vessels for biblical truth, it wasn't merely translating the gospel, it reshaped it. After AD 70, the centre of gravity shifted decisively. The temple was gone, and the priesthood along with it. Jerusalem was no longer the interpretive anchor. Judaism reorganized around rabbinic tradition. Christianity, immersed in Hellenism, reorganized around Greek intellectual culture. This was far from a neutral transition. It created a vacuum, and Greek philosophy rushed in to fill it. What we now call the church is not simply apostolic Judaism with Jesus added on. It is a Hellenistic project formed in a world where Hebrew categories were receding and Greek ones felt natural and authoritative. Make no mistake, this shift was theological, and we can follow this linguistically, pinpointing where language shaped the imaginations of the early church fathers. When the Hebrew scriptures moved into Greek through the Septuagint, meanings shifted. Sheol became Hades. Sheol is the grave, the realm of the dead. It's not a moral sorting ground. It is non-dualistic. There is no torment. There is no reward, no hierarchy. Everyone goes to Sheol. It is simply death's domain. Hades, by contrast, is a mythological underworld, structured, moralized, populated with judges, spirits, punishments, and rewards. it introduces a conscious afterlife geography that owes so much more to Greek imagination than to Israel's covenant story. Nefesh became psyche. Nefesh refers to a living, breathing being, a whole embodied person, not a separate inner entity. Psyche, however, denotes an immaterial soul detachable from the body, the core self that survives independently, a philosophical abstraction rather than a relational life sustained by God. In Hebrew thought, tzedakah refers to covenant fidelity, right order within the community, justice that restores. In Greek, the kaiosune leans toward legal and forensic categories, focused on status, verdict, and moral accounting, rather than relational faithfulness. This is why David confuses Hellenized Christianity. David looks reckless, emotionally volatile, morally inconsistent, and yet Scripture calls him a man after God's heart. Why? Because covenant faithfulness in Hebrew thought is not moral perfection. It is relational return. David repents. He reorientates. He comes back. A Greek moral lens struggles to see that because it wants stability of virtue rather than restoration of relationship. Platonism introduced a devastating assumption that the material world is lesser, corrupt, that salvation is escape, that truth is rapture. That is not covenant theology, that is metaphysical dualism. As this thinking developed through Neoplatonism, God became increasingly abstract and impersonal, approached through intellect rather than covenant faithfulness. Illumination replaced obedience, assent displaced history. Stoicism reinforced the problem in a different way. Its emphasis on rational control reframed the kingdom as a moral philosophy rather than a historical covenantal event. Once that shift takes hold, an eschatological fulfillment in AD 70 becomes impossible to see. Why would God end an age in history if the real story is assumed to unfold in timeless abstraction? I don't offer this to mock, but to cohere to the truth. The early church fathers were sincere, courageous, and smart people, but they were not Hebrew thinkers. Justin Martyr regularly relies on the Septuagint and conflates Greek philosophical categories with prophecy. Dialogue with Trypho reveals consistent misunderstandings of Jewish interpretive framework. Irenaeus famously argues that Jesus lived into his late 40s, driven by theological symbolism rather than historical memory. He also misplaces apostolic timelines and Roman chronology. Origen spiritualizes prophecy almost entirely, detaching it from Israel's historical narrative and relocating fulfillment within the inner life. Tertullian and Ignatius reflect on increasingly institutional and moralized frameworks that sideline covenant fulfillment in favour of church order and virtue formation. These men were not foolish, they were not always wrong, they were simply looking through the wrong lens. And when the lens is wrong, even fulfilled prophecy can appear unfinished. The church did not miss the end of the age because God failed to act. It missed because its categories changed. Covenant became contract. Relationship became metaphysics. History became allegory. And fulfillment became postponement. By the time the dust settled, the kingdom had arrived, the age had ended, and the church was waiting for something that had already happened. The tragedy isn't that the church got everything wrong. It's that it forgot its own story. The end of the world was missed because the church stopped thinking like Israel and started thinking like Athens.